Malcolm, we're just so proud of you, Mrs. Swirlin exclaimed when she heard about my election. It was all over the restaurant where I worked. Even the state man, Maynard Allen, who still dropped by to see me once in a while, had a word of praise. He said he never saw anybody prove better exactly what reform meant. I really liked him except for one thing. He now and then would drop something that hinted my mother had let us down somehow. Fairly often, I would go and visit the Lyonses, and they acted as happy as though I was one of their children. And it was the same warm feeling when I went into Lansing to visit my brothers and sisters and the Gohanneses. I remember one thing that marred this time for me. The movie Gone with the Wind, when it played in Mason, I was the only Negro in the theater, and when Butterfly McQueen went into her act, I felt like crawling under the rug. Every Saturday, just about, I would go into Lansing. I was going on 14 now. Wilfred and Hilda still lived out by themselves at the old family home. Hilda kept the house very clean. It was easier than my mother's plight with 8 of us always underfoot or running around. Wilfred worked wherever he could, and he still read every book he could get his hands on. Filbert was getting a reputation as one of the better amateur fighters in this part of the state. Everyone really expected that he was going to become a professional. Reginald and I, after my fighting fiasco, had finally gotten back on good terms. It made me feel great to visit him and Wesley over at Mrs. Williams's. I'd offhandedly give them each a couple of dollars to just stick in their pockets, to have something to spend. And little Yvonne and Robert were doing okay, too, over at the home of the West Indian lady, Mrs. McGuire. I'd give them about a quarter apiece. It made me feel good to see how they were coming along. None of us talked much about our mother, and we never mentioned our father. I guess none of us knew what to say. We didn't want anyone else to mention our mother either, I think. From time to time, though, we would all go over to Kalamazoo to visit her. Most often, we older ones went singly, for it was something you didn't want to have to experience with anyone else present, even your brother or sister. During this period, the visit to my mother that I most remember was toward the end of that 7th grade year, when our father's grown daughter by his first marriage, Ella, came from Boston to visit us. Wilfred and Hilda had exchanged some letters with Ella, and I, at Hilda's suggestion, had written to her from the Swirlins. We were all excited and happy when her letter told us that she was coming to Lansing. I think the major impact of Ella's arrival, at least upon me, was that she was the first really proud black woman I had ever seen in my life. She was plainly proud of her very dark skin. This was unheard of among Negroes in those days, especially in Lansing. I hadn't been sure just what day she would come, and then one afternoon I got home from school, and there she was. She hugged me, stood me away, looked me up and down. A commanding woman, maybe even bigger than Mrs. Swirlin. Ella wasn't just black, but like our father, she was jet black. The way she sat, moved, talked, did everything, bespoke somebody who did and got exactly what she wanted. This was the woman my father had boasted of so often for having brought so many of their family out of Georgia to Boston. She owned some property, he would say, and she was in society. She had come north with nothing, and she had worked and saved and had invested in property that she built up in value, and then she started sending money to Georgia for another sister, brother, cousin, niece, or nephew to come north to Boston. All that I had heard was reflected in Ella's appearance and bearing. I had never been so impressed with anybody. She was in her second marriage. Her first husband had been a doctor. Ella asked all kinds of questions about how I was doing. She had already heard from Wilfred and Hilda about my election as class president. She asked especially about my grades, and I ran and got my report cards. I was then one of the 3 highest in class. Ella praised me. I asked her about her brother Earl and her sister Mary. She had the exciting news that Earl was a singer with a band in Boston. He was singing under the name of Jimmy Carlton. Mary was also doing well. Ella told me about other relatives from that branch of the family. A number of them I'd never heard of. She had helped them up from Georgia. They, in their turn, had helped up others. We Littles have to stick together, Ella said. It thrilled me to hear her say that, and even more, the way she said it. I had become a mascot. Our branch of the family was split to pieces. I had just about forgotten about being a little in any family sense. She said that different members of the family were working in good jobs, and some even had small businesses going. Most of them were homeowners. When Ella suggested that all of us Littles in Lansing accompany her on a visit to our mother, we were all grateful. We all felt that if anyone could do anything that could help our mother, that might help her get well and come back, it would be Ella. Anyway, all of us, for the first time together, went with Ella to Kalamazoo. Our mother was smiling when they brought her out. She was extremely surprised when she saw Ella. They made a striking contrast, the thin, near white woman and the big black one, hugging each other. I don't remember much about the rest of the visit except that there was a lot of talking and Ella had everything in hand, and we left with all of us feeling better than we ever had about the circumstances. I know that for the first time, I felt as though I had visited with someone who had some kind of physical illness that had just lingered on. A few days later, after visiting the homes where each of us were staying, Ella left Lansing and returned to Boston. But before leaving, she told me to write to her regularly, and she had suggested that I might like to spend my summer holiday visiting her in Boston. I jumped at the chance. That summer of 1940 in Lansing, I caught the Greyhound bus for Boston with my cardboard suitcase and wearing my green suit. If someone had hung a sign, "Hick," around my neck, I couldn't have looked much more obvious. They didn't have the turnpikes then. The bus stopped at what seemed every corner and cowpatch. From my seat in, you guessed it, the back of the bus, I gawked out of the window at white man's America rolling past for what seemed a month, but must have been only a day and a half. When we finally arrived, Ella met me at the terminal and took me home. The house was on Wambeck Street in the Sugar Hill section of Roxbury, the Harlem of Boston. I met Ella's second husband, Frank, who was now a soldier, and her brother, Earl, the singer who called himself Jimmy Carlton, and Mary, who was very different from her older sister. It's funny how I seem to think of Mary as Ella's sister instead of her being just as Ella is my own half-sister. It's probably because Ella and I always were much closer as basic types. We're dominant people, and Mary has always been mild and quiet, almost shy. Ella was busily involved in dozens of things. She belonged to I don't know how many different clubs. She was a leading light of local so-called black society. I saw and met 100 black people there whose big city talk and ways left my mouth hanging open. I couldn't have feigned indifference if I had tried to. People talked casually about Chicago, Detroit, New York. I didn't know the world contained as many Negroes as I saw thronging downtown Roxbury at night, especially on Saturdays. Neon lights, nightclubs, pool halls, bars, the cars they drove. Restaurants made the streets smell. Rich, greasy, down-home black cooking. Jukeboxes blared Erskine Hawkins, Duke Ellington, Cootie Williams, dozens of others. If somebody had told me then that someday I'd know them all personally, I'd have found it hard to believe. The biggest bands like these played at the Roseland State Ballroom on Boston's Massachusetts Avenue. One night for Negroes, the next night for whites. I saw for the first time occasional black and white couples strolling around arm in arm. And on Sundays, when Ella, Mary, or somebody took me to church, I saw churches for black people such as I had never seen. They were many times finer than the white church I had attended back in Mason, Michigan. There, the white people just sat and worshiped with the words. But the Boston Negroes, like all other Negroes I had ever seen at church, threw their souls and bodies wholly into worship. 2 or 3 times I wrote letters to Wilfred intended for everybody back in Lansing. I said I'd try to describe it when I got back, but I found I couldn't. My restlessness with Mason, and for the first time in my life, a restlessness with being around white people, began as soon as I got back home and entered 8th grade. I continued to think constantly about all that I had seen in Boston and about the way I had felt there. I know now that it was the sense of being a real part of a mass of my own kind for the first time. The white people, classmates, the Swirlins, the people at the restaurant where I worked noticed the change. They said, "You're acting so strange. You don't seem like yourself, Malcolm. What's the matter?" I kept close to the top of the class, though. The topmost scholastic standing, I remember, kept shifting between me, a girl named Audrey Slaw, and a boy named Jimmy Cotton. It went on that way as I became increasingly restless and disturbed through the first semester, and then one day, just about when those of us who had passed were about to move up to 8A, from which we would enter high school the next year, something happened which was to become the first major turning point of my life. Somehow I happened to be alone in the classroom with Mr. Ostrowski, my English teacher. He was a tall, rather reddish white man, and he had a thick mustache. I had gotten some of my best marks under him, and he had always made me feel that he liked me. He was, as I have mentioned, a natural-born advisor about what you ought to read, to do, or think about any and everything. We used to make unkind jokes about him. Why was he teaching in Mason instead of somewhere else, getting for himself some of the success in life that he kept telling us how to get? I know that he probably meant well in what he happened to advise me that day. I doubt that he meant any harm. It was just in his nature as an American white man. I was one of his top students, one of the school's top students. But all he could see for me was the kind of future in your place that almost all white people see for black people. He told me, "Malcolm, you ought to be thinking about a career. Have you been giving it thought?" The truth is I hadn't. I never have figured out why I told him, "Well, yes, sir, I've been thinking I'd like to be a lawyer." Lansing certainly had no Negro lawyers or doctors either in those days to hold up an image I might have aspired to. All I really knew for certain was that a lawyer didn't wash dishes as I was doing. Mr. Ostrowski looked surprised, I remember, and leaned back in his chair and clasped his hands behind his head. He kind of half smiled and said, "Malcolm, one of life's first needs is for us to be realistic. Don't misunderstand me now. We all here like you know that. But you've got to be realistic about being a nigger. A lawyer? That's no realistic goal for a nigger. You need to think about something you can be. You're good with your hands, making things. Everybody admires your carpentry shop work. Why don't you plan on carpentry? People like you as a person. You'd get all kinds of work." The more I thought afterwards about what he said, the more uneasy it made me. It just kept treading around in my mind. What made it really begin to disturb me was Mr. Ostrowski's advice to others in my class, all of them white. Most of them had told him they were planning to become farmers. But those who wanted to strike out on their own, to try something new, he had encouraged. Some, mostly girls, wanted to be teachers. A few wanted other professions, such as one boy who wanted to become a county agent, another a veterinarian, and one girl wanted to be a nurse. They all reported that Mr. Ostrowski had encouraged what they had wanted, yet nearly none of them had earned marks equal to mine. It was a surprising thing that I had never thought of it that way before, but I realized that whatever I wasn't, I was smarter than nearly all of those white kids. But apparently, I was still not intelligent enough in their eyes to become whatever I wanted to be. It was then that I began to change. Inside. I drew away from white people. I came to class and I answered when called upon. It became a physical strain, simply to sit in Mr. Ostrowski's class. Where nigger had slipped off my back before, wherever I heard it now, I stopped and looked at whoever said it, and they looked surprised that I did. I quit hearing so much nigger and what's wrong, which was the way I wanted it. Nobody, including the teachers, could decide what had come over me. I knew I was being discussed. In a few more weeks, it was that way, too, at the restaurant where I worked washing dishes and at the Swirlins. One day soon after, Mrs. Swirlin called me into the living room, and there was the state man, Maynard Allen. I knew from their faces that something was about to happen. She told me that none of them could understand why, after I had done so well in school and on my job and living with them, and after everyone in Mason had come to like me, I had lately begun to make them all feel that I wasn't happy there anymore. She said she felt there was no need for me to stay at the detention home any longer, and that arrangements had been made for me to go and live with the Lyons family who liked me so much. She stood up and put out her hand. "I guess I've asked you 100 times, Malcolm. Do you want to tell me what's wrong?" I shook her hand and said, "Nothing, Mrs. Swirlin." Then I went and got my things and came back down. At the living room door, I saw her wiping her eyes. I felt very bad. I thanked her and went out in front to Mr. Allen, who took me over to the Lyonses. Mr. and Mrs. Lyons and their children, during the 2 months I lived with them, while finishing the 8th grade, also tried to get me to tell them what was wrong, but somehow I couldn't tell them either. I went every Saturday to see my brothers and sisters in Lansing, and almost every other day I wrote to Ella in Boston. Not saying why, I told Ella that I wanted to come there and live. I don't know how she did it, but she arranged for official custody of me to be transferred from Michigan to Massachusetts. And the very week I finished the 8th grade, I again boarded the Greyhound bus for Boston. I've thought about that time a lot since then. No physical move in my life has been more pivotal or profound in its repercussions. If I had stayed on in Michigan, I would probably have married one of those Negro girls I knew and liked in Lansing. I might have become one of those state capitol building shoeshine boys, or a Lansing country club waiter, or gotten one of the other menial jobs which in those days among Lansing Negroes would have been considered successful, or even become a carpenter. Whatever I have done since then, I have driven myself to become a success at it. I've often thought that if Mr. Ostrowski had encouraged me to become a lawyer, I would today probably be among some city's professional black bourgeoisie, sipping cocktails and palming myself off as a community spokesman for and leader of the suffering black masses, while my primary concern would be to grab a few more crumbs from the groaning board of the two-faced whites with whom they're begging to integrate. All praise is due to Allah that I went to Boston when I did. If I hadn't, I'd probably still be a brainwashed black Christian.